Well, thank you. This is a subject that, up until 1963, had been the subject of vigorous debate for 63 years, since 1900. And then in 1963, the debate stopped. And needless to say, in the ensuing 52 years, an awful lot has been discovered. A great deal of material has been made accessible so that you can now readily go in and peruse journals and paintings and maps and so on. And so we are drawing on that new material and that now readily accessible material in order to revisit this question that was vigorously debated for so long. Where in Sydney Cove did Phillip land? Why does this matter? Well, it matters for me, most importantly, because it tells us what Phillip was worrying about on the morning of the 26th of January tells you an awful lot about the man. Was this all about him, or was he, in fact, worrying about the convicts? Was he concerned with practical matters or ceremonial matters? It's also important because it leads you into an understanding of the way in which the ships were located, the ships were used, and what was happening over that first year as they began to establish the settlement. It raises those fundamental questions. Some background to begin with, so we sort of start on a common platform. The fleet arrives in Botany Bay over the 18th, 19th and 20th of January. Phillip has realised by the 20th that Botany Bay is not suitable for a colony of this size. It won't support it. There's not enough water and the soil's too sandy. He goes up on the 21st in some boats with a group to north, and they discover Sydney Harbour, and he then proceeds to explore the various coves and selects Sydney Cove and returns on the 23rd to Botany Bay. On the 25th in the Supply, he returns to Sydney Cove on the afternoon, and it's too late in the day to go ashore, and at daybreak on the 26th they go ashore, the advance party lands, they begin clearing ground, and the flag raising ceremony is held, and that evening the rest of the fleet arrives. And on the 27th the merchant ships warp into the cove. That means they are pulled into the cove by anchors. A crew will take an anchor out and the ship will be pulled in because there isn't room to be tacking in the cove. And the Marines and the first of the male convicts go ashore. That's the chronology. The geography, it's important to understand that in 1788 and for a long time thereafter, Sydney Cove is a V, not a U. So there's a lot of confusion about some of the language that's used because people think Sydney Cove then looked like it does today as a U. But this is a French map from 1802, and you can see the bridge at Bridge Street there, and the tide, until the 1820s, the tidal movements came up to that bridge. So the settlement on the east side, which is here, and the west side on the other side is deeply divided. The west side is the convicts and Marines, the east side is the gentleman's quarter, and the settlement is deeply divided. It's also important, and we'll come back on this, here's a Dawes drawing from July 1788. Again, you'll see that V shape, but notice the dotted sections, that's sand flats and mud flats. So up the top of the cove, there are sand flats, and further down are rocks. And so this is a photo of Vaucluse Bay today, and you can see that same pattern. Up the top, you can see it's sand and then quite shallow water, and then further down, it's rock, and it drops off much more precipitously, and you can anchor boats quite close to the shore. So that's the sort of pattern that we would have seen in Sydney Cove in 1788. It is generally agreed, and this is sort of important again by way of background, the only person to make this point is David Collins, but nobody has ever disagreed with this point, that the landing and the ceremony occur very close to each other. Collins says in this quote that we went back close to where we had landed to hold the ceremony. So discussions, when we talk about where did they land, discussions about where was the ceremony held are basically telling us roughly, it was somewhere similar to that where the landing would have occurred. And then finally, the question, were there two ceremonies? Some of you may be aware of this. There are two copies of Philip Gidley King's journal, one of which seems to say that they held a ceremony at daylight, and the other one seems to say they held a ceremony in the afternoon. And some people have said, oh, well, there must have been 2 ceremonies. In fact, this is the only source for a morning ceremony. Neither of these 2 journals are the original. They are both copies, they're both fair copies, if you like, of an earlier journal, the one he had, and he was taking notes in day by day. And it looks as though there's a transcription problem. So these are the 2 copies side by side. The next day at daylight, the Marines and convicts were landed. And we did all this stuff. Afternoon, the Union Jack was hoisted on shore and we had this ceremony. And here, you've basically got the same structure to this, but there are key parts missing. And it's likely, since no one else refers to a morning, to 2 ceremonies or a morning ceremony, the evidence points strongly to an afternoon ceremony. And so what's happened is some text has been dropped. So we're dealing with a landing at daybreak in the morning and a ceremony in the afternoon. And you'll see us come back on that, those themes in the course of the presentation.
Thank you, Gary. So I'm going to basically proceed, but I just wanted to quickly start by saying thanks to the Society for inviting us. And as a historian, I always like to think back to Bill Clinton's story he used to tell, that he had a sign on his desk, it's the economy stupid. But for historians, I think it's a good idea for us to have, it's the original sources stupid. And we just always need to hark back to them. We take note of the secondary sources, what people said 100 years later or whatever, but the original sources. And the example Gary gave about subjecting Philip Gidley King's journals to close scrutiny are really important. Now, we are jumping forward now to 1900, one of the first meetings of this organisation, the Royal Australian Historical Society. Alfred Lee gave a lecture on this topic, where did Governor Phillip land? And he said, for many years it has been generally accepted that Governor Phillip landed on the morning of 26th of January, 88, somewhere on the west side near the Dawes Point. He disagreed. His talk, his paper was about this idea he had that it was on the east side, that it was around Macquarie Place. That was the argument. Proceed, jump forward, 6 years later, 1907. What you see today, the anchor of HMS Sirius, the cannons in Macquarie Place, they were placed there as a memorial. And at the same time, a flagstaff and a plaque were erected by the British Empire League, the women's group, and Alfred Lee's wife was a member, Minnie Lee. She was quite involved in privately erecting this memorial, which stated that this was the place where Phillip raised the flag on 26th of January, 1788. A few years later, A.G. Foster, an important member of the RAHS, published his own case. He rejected what the Lees were saying. He said, it's on the west side, we've got these sources that say it, but it was difficult because none of the original sources, David Collins, the others, any of the ones available to them, said east or west. They just said, we landed. In 1918, significant development. A Mitchell Library librarian found an almanac published in 1806 with a list of a chronology of occurrences in the early colony. Governor King, who was there on that day, was the governor. He authorised this. Howe was the government printer. It actually specifically identifies the location on the west side, near the dockyard, which in 1806 was near where Cadman's Cottage is. Jump forward to 1920. There was a debate at the RAHS, not here at this building at that time. Very passionate. There were tears, raised voices. Happened many times, I'm sure, in the society. No conclusion was reached. Foster published a booklet, again on the west side. Jump forward to 1924, another discovery, the manuscript journal of James Bradley, a lieutenant, a naval lieutenant on the First Fleet, with pictures, illustrations. Now, again, tears, raised voices, argument, articles in the paper. People took a lively interest in these issues. You used to read them in the Sydney Morning Herald and other Sydney newspapers, and in national newspapers. People in Perth were interested in this. Jump forward to 1954, a proposal to set up a plaque at the landing place, more disagreements. 1963, the 175th anniversary of the landing. The installation of historic markers was discussed. Disagreement again over the landing place. The Heron Committee, appointed by the City Council, came to a conclusion. Most of the members of that committee were not historians, but they concluded that where the 1907 memorial was, Macquarie Place, Loftus Street, was the spot. What you see now in that spot is a memorial erected in 1967. It's still there. This is the memorial put up in 1967. You can see it on the footpath next to the Customs House, circular quay station down below it. This is the place that we're proposing in this lecture as where Phillip actually landed. And on the left, you'll see a very unprepossessing piece of Sydney urban design, a demountable toilet. At the bottom of the steps, you can just see on the right, the Bethel steps, which lead up to George Street, next to the Mariners Church, now a bar, a beautiful historic building. As you walk up the steps, you look through a window which shows the excavation of Bethel Street, which once existed on that site. And there is a plaque there which does raise the fact that there has been a debate about this being the first landing place. So we are talking now about the basis for the view that we've come to. First Fleet recollections and journals, diaries. They are a mixture of sources compiled on the day. We have Surgeon Beau Smythe of the First Fleet. Literally, we have the original journal that he was writing on the ship. Jumping forward through to Nagle, a young naval seaman who was an American who wrote his memoirs many years later, but he had a good, vivid memory. There's a picture of the gum tree on the ridge where the Mariners Church is. The Obelisk Macquarie Place, as I've mentioned, which was the focus even of conspiracy theories. Somebody even suggested that Macquarie had erected it to mark the spot, even though Macquarie makes no mention of that whatever. The oral traditions. This is a really important thing, and we need the original sources, but also there are important aspects of the Bide, and oral history is often dismissed. It was dismissed by Alfred Lee in 1901. And there were particularly three old men in the 1880s, 90s, around 1900, who said, this is not what we heard when we were young in the 1820s, what Alfred Lee was saying. And then there is the complication of Bradley's manuscript, which we'll talk about. So, the landing place, 22nd, 23rd January. Phillip probably spent the night there, the first time he was exploring in the little boats. Jacob Nagle recalls, he was rowing Governor Phillip's boat. And this is him recalling. We landed on the west side of the cove. Alongshore was all bushes, but a small distance from the head of the cove was level, and large trees, but scattering, and no underwood worth mentioning, and a run of fresh water running down the centre of the cove. The governor, officers and seamen went up to see it.
This manuscript was found in 1982, so in 1963 we didn't have this.
Yes. So, jumping back to Phillip's own account, I fixed on about the selection of Sydney Cove. And this is also part of our argument, is looking at what was said in the original sources, but also just thinking about the compelling logic, the geographical logic of the location, the topography of the site. Could he get big ships up to the south end of Sydney Cove? And what was his motivation? Why was he landing at a particular spot? Where was the first wharf? Where was the first landing place? Where was the flag staff put up on 26th of January? And Phillip said, I fixed on the cove that had the best spring of water, which ships can anchor so close to the shore that at a very small expense quays may be made at which the largest ships may unload. So this is Arthur Beau Smythe, as I mentioned. This is his original journal. In fact, we only recently discovered that there are two copies of his journal, one in the Mitchell Library, one in the National Library. The one in the National Library in Canberra has text, which we've only even discovered this text was not in the other, which was published decades ago. The harbour had many rock eminences, and he's really talking about Sydney Cove here. Quite perpendicular, perfectly flat on top, which will answer every purpose of loading and unloading the largest ships, equally the same as if made by the most expert workmen. He's talking about a natural wharf, where the ships can go close, where you can unload the convicts and goods.
So, sorry, and that's quite in 1974?
Quite in 1974, and in fact, it wasn't published. The one in the Mitchell Library, which is not the original, which doesn't contain that text, was published in the about 25 or 30 years ago. So Nagle again, 8 of us that belonged to the governor's barge pitched our tent by the waterside on a rock near the landing place, and the boat in view. And Phillip did not move ashore. He was until the 19th of February. Phillip was actually, he had a canvas house, which wasn't erected until it began to be erected until the 28th of January. He went back and forth every night and every day, rowed back on shore, and that's what Jacob Nagle was doing. They were rowing the governor, and had the Sirius, where Governor Phillip was residing, was at the south end of the cove towards the North Shore, and we're saying that Nagle and his boat's crew were on that site around where the Mariners Church is, with the boat parked up on a little beach. ferrying the governor back and forth from this to this landing place. Now, this is the key document that we discovered, which in many ways is the huge piece of evidence. This is the first piece of evidence from a young sailor on the Lady Penrhyn, John Campbell, just a young man. It's a letter that he wrote to his parents in 1789 describing what happened, basically. And I'm just going to jump forward, but essentially on the 26th, they arrived the same day. The governor went on shore to take possession of the land with a company of grenadiers and some convicts. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he sent on board the supply for the Union Jack. Then orders was gave for the soldiers to march down the west side of the Cove. They cut down one of the trees, fixed as a flagstaff, hoisted the Jack, and fired 4 volleys of small arms, which answered with 3 cheers from the brig. Then they marched up the head of the Cove where they pitched their tents. Now, this document I came across in 2011. I'm working on a biographical dictionary of the First Fleet, rewriting Mollie Gillen's book. I worked with Mollie on her work on the First Fleeters. She had never seen this document. I had never seen this document until 2011. It had been digitised by the Mitchell Library and had been in the library since the 19th century, but it actually hadn't been labelled as a First Fleet document. We didn't know. And when Alfred Lee was making his arguments in the early 19th century, arguing with Foster, Lee was saying, you haven't got a document that shows anyone who was on the First Fleet who says it was the West Side. You haven't got it. And Foster would say, if only we had a document like that. This is that document. And we have this other key piece of evidence, Howe's Almanac. I mentioned it before. This is a chronology published in the Almanac of historical events in the early colony. It covers 1788 right up to when it was published. Little events of importance. 1788, British colours hoisted on the north point of the present dockyard and possession taken by Governor Phillip, Lieutenants Ball and King of the Royal Navy and Lieutenants Johnston, Collins, Dawes of the Marines. Now, the other key point here is that their presence of Johnston and Collins, and that is George Johnston and William Collins, the younger brother of David Collins. Nobody else could have known that. None of the journals were available to the people who could find the almanac. That could only have come. None of the published descriptions of the First Fleet, nothing mentions that Johnston and Collins were there on that day. This is the only thing that mentions that.
Up until 1915, when we get Beau Smyth's Mitchell Library Journal. So 1915 is that's when we first know that they're there, other than this source.
But also this reflects that it's come from someone who was there, because how else would he know? And the most likely candidate is Governor King, who was there on that day. So the other plank is the recollections of First Fleeters. This is also a key document. This is one of the last convicts of the First Fleet. He died in Sydney, near Sydney in 1947. 1847. John Lyne-Burnham. Jack remembered the British flag being first hoisted in Sydney on a swamp oak tree, that's a casuarina, which was placed in the spot at rear of Cadman's house, now occupied as the Water Police Court. Bell's Life, September 1847, sorry. Now, Bell's Life, this journal was only digitised on Trove in the last 3 years. That obituary, there were other obituaries known, we didn't mention this text. This was, nobody knew about this obituary. It was extremely obscure, it had been laying in the archives. So, other recollections. Now, Richard Kemp is another key figure. He is one of the old men who came forward in the 1880s, 90s, when this talk and argument that we're trying to work out, a lot of it was associated with the centenary of the colony in 1888. Where did they land? And when people were starting to say East Side, Kemp was one of the old people who said, I was born at the Rocks in 1823. I was told that it was at the Mariners Church site. This is what everyone knew when I was young. And other people who weren't there, who weren't born, were telling me the opposite. He was struggling. He was writing letters to the paper. And this is a key piece of evidence as well. 20 years ago, I was walking past the Mariners Church with the second son of, he mentions George Morris as an acquaintance, when he suddenly stopped, pointed out across the water, that is where Governor Phillip landed and hoisted his flag. How do you know that? I said. He replied, some years ago we had a man in our employ who came out with the fleet and used to tell us all about it. He pointed out the place of landing where the flag was hoisted. Now, it was possibly William Bond, again one of the last First Fleeters in Sydney, who died in 1839, who did live with a family called Morris. There's more research to be done to confirm that, but that is a possible interpretation of who that George Morris was. Either way, it's come from somebody who was on the First Fleet. Now, this is another key piece of evidence. A casuarina growing in front of the old Surgeon General's house, just behind where Cameron's cottage is now, on George Street. In 1832, that tree was chopped down by government employees, and it caused protests because there was a story attached to that tree at the time. It was important to people. It was actually one of the earliest pieces of heritage activism. This tree, this is the Sydney Herald, at the lower end of George Street near the dockyard, upon which the British flag was first hoisted in the town, had been lately cut down by the gang employed in repairing the streets. The tree was considered sacred by Governor Macquarie and the old hands of the colony. And old hands is a shorthand for the old convicts, the early convicts. So this is a view of looking from the Mariners Church site at 100 George Street at the Rocks, behind the overseas passenger terminal, looking towards the city, looking south. What you can see is the winding George Street. And the tree that was chopped down in 1832 is there. It's a youngish tree, but that's what was there in 1832. Jump forward to another picture from the same view, a little bit to the left, also looking towards the city, down George Street. Again, there is the tree. This is about 1804. It's getting bigger. By the 1820s, by the 30s, it was a big casuarina, one of the only trees left in the Rocks. People were sentimental about it. There you can see the dockyard here, and that is the site. That's the side of the dockyard. You can see the dockyard behind it with the ship being built. And where that circle is where Cadman's was subsequently built, a bit over 10 years after this picture. The gum tree on the ridge. Okay, this is a picture attributed to Governor Hunter in the State Library of Victoria. And Gary, who is an extremely assiduous researcher, went to the trouble of cajoling the librarians in Melbourne to, again, you can see the tree here. Again, this is the casuarina tree at the Cadman site. And there is a tree on the left, take note of that. Now, Gary found the inscription on the rear of this picture, and the text of that picture reads, "This drawing was made by Admiral Hunter, 2nd Governor of New South Wales, 1793. The old gum tree first carried the King's flag hoisted by Governor Phillips. The frigate Sirius was afterwards wrecked on Norfolk Island." So this is someone in the 19th century who's been told a story. Has it come from Governor Hunter itself? Is it from these papers? The provenance of this picture we don't know. It came to the library in Victoria in the 19th century, probably. But this is another piece of evidence. And again, the tree that you saw on the left was quite little at that time. But there is a mature tree showing here on the Mariners Church site. Did that tree originally mark the spot? And then when that was cut down, that disappeared by the mid-1790s, that tree. This little one was the only one left, and the story became attached to it. Now, this is jumping forward to Macquarie Place. This is the obelisk, Macquarie Obelisk in Macquarie Place. And what you have here is a book about Sydney published by Joseph Fowles in 1848, a recent arrival to the colony, who writes, "On the 26th of January, sufficient space for military and convicts to encamp upon having been cleared, they were landed near where the obelisk now stands, and the national flag was hoisted." But in fact, this is the earliest mention of this site in any source that we can find for that site, 1848. And we have somebody in 1789 writing the other story. But this is what they're arguing about. And this is, in a sense, a recent arrival writing, which is probably his interpretation of reading David Collins or reading books about the early colony. In contrast, we have the old people who are old men in the 1880s and 90s, 1882, Thomas Brenner. He writes, he was born in 1813 at Cattai, but in fact he was raised by Captain John Piper, who was a naval officer who had the house on this site, and we'll see it. John Piper was his partner, was the daughter of a First Fleet convict, and Thomas Brennan may well have known this old man who died in 1838, who was a First Fleet convict, who was his essentially step-grandfather. So he writes, in 1882, in George Street North stood a large she oak tree nearly opposite Argyle Street, about 2 feet from the old dockyard wall, where it was said the first flag was hoisted when the country was taken possession of. When a boy, I and other boys often climbed up the oak tree. Then Richard Kemp again, he's a key witness, he writes a number of letters to the paper. In 1904, there was at the present time between the Mariners Church and the Sailors' Home, and it was at the foot of this street that Governor Phillip landed in a little sandy nook behind a very large rock, portions of which no doubt still remain at the southwest corner of this street, under a very fine forest oak tree. The ceremony was held not more than 50 yards from the Governor's landing place. And that's essentially, he's saying, the tree in 1832 marked the site of the ceremony. The landing place was below the Mariners Church. This is the Bradley picture of Sydney Cove, which probably the journal itself and probably the pictures were actually not, as was previously believed, painted and written at the time in 1780s, 90s. He did this back in England around 1802 or later. And in fact, this is actually possibly even a copy of Governor Hunter's picture of Sydney Cove published in his book on the colony in 1792. So this is what influenced people, a flag on the west side, but it's dated 20th of August 1788. We all agree there was a little redoubt. There was a little redoubt there, little fort, and the flag was erected there. It was there on the King's birthday, 4th of June 1788. We're just saying it was erected after 26th of January. Bradley's journal contains a reference to the latitude and longitude of the flagstaff as at 6th of February 1788. And this was regarded as a key piece of evidence by the people on the west side. But again, Gary has looked into this reading and fed it into the sites we can have now for latitude and longitude. This is the reading given by Bradley, and this shows the location there. So something was wrong, and something went wrong. And what we believe went wrong was that when the first fleet arrived, they had the latest chronometer that was the new technology helping you. Longitude was the difficult thing. But the crucial thing about this instrument is you had to keep it wound. If it stopped, you've lost your timing. It had to be extremely precise. Somebody forgot to wind it on the voyage. This results in us having the wrong readings for the flagstaff. But the latitude was right. And in fact, the latitude, ironically, this was used by the arguments, people arguing for the east side. That's Customs House is on that latitude. That so also is the corner of Essex and George Street, where the ceremony, the second ceremony was held on 7th of February 1788. When Phillip's commission was read, the legislation was proclaimed, all of the convicts were gathered together, Phillip made his famous speech, and they held a flag-raising ceremony, the second one. So again, yes, and I just described that for you, so I'll jump forward. And so we're saying there were two flagstaffs, or at least two flag raisings. And this picture is by George Raper of North Island Settlement 1790. And Governor King tells us in his journal that he erected one flagstaff, and then some months later he found that it was too difficult for ships to see from when they were approaching shore. So he erected a second flagstaff. And here we see the two of them in 1790. He left the other one there. People thought that this big flagstaff they saw in the picture in Sydney Cove had been there since January 1788. It was the same one. People they ran these things up quickly. The one on January 26, 1788 was quickly run up. These were run up. You can have two. You can have more than one. So there are several. This is the argument we're putting. I'm just going to hand it on to Gary.
Right. So where on the west side? There's really sort of three places where conceivably this might have occurred. The first of these is the head of the Cove. If you look at the history of New South Wales from the records, historical records of New South Wales, the editors say it was at the head of the Cove. They didn't say it was on the eastern side of the tank stream. They just said the head of the Cove. And some later historians, because they were thinking of a U shape, not a V shape, thought, oh, well, that means it's the east side. But in 1788, that's not how they used the term head of the Cove. Collins said the detachment of Marines was encamped at the head of the Cove near the stream, and on the west side was placed the body of the convicts. The Marines were camped on the west side along with the convicts. So here's the head of the Cove being used to refer to the west side. King, the place at which the settlement is to be made is at the head of a cove, at the head of which a small rivulet empties itself. The shore on either side is bounded by rocks. You'll see from some other references here, it's the flow of water that identifies the head of the cove. It's the stream coming in. Tench, Watkin Tench was a captain, marine captain, with the First Fleet. Into the head of the cove, which our establishment is fixed, runs a small stream of fresh water. Again, this is where the stream flows in. John Campbell, they marched up to the head of the cove where they pitched their tents. Again, it's the Marines on the west side. We know the Marines were on the west side, and that's being called head of the cove. And here in 1803, they're talking about the bridge being rebuilt, which in the line next to the old wooden one, which was built years before, which crosses the head of the cove. The head of the cove is referring to the stream that's flowing down the tank, what we came to call the tank stream. The other possibility then as you move down, and where Algernon Talmadge in his famous painting seems to suggest it occurs, and what is implied by an east side landing, is that they were landing on sand. This is problematic because that wasn't sort of a nice sandy beach with deep water. You've got a problem with sand flats that run out for some distance. So this is Dawes showing those in 1788. This is David Collins writing of the hospital wharf, which becomes the main wharf on the west side, which is built from 1790. We don't quite know when it was finished. A wharf was also marked out on the west side, which was to be carried far enough out into deep water to admit of the loaded hoy coming alongside at any time of tide. This is just on the southern side of the Museum of Contemporary Art. That's where the hospital wharf was. And in 1790, they had to erect a wharf that got over the problem of landing on sand, which with certain tides was really problematic. This is a painting by a French artist who was here in 1802, and you can see the bridge over the tank stream. Here's the tank stream coming in. It's sort of at an unusual angle, and here is a ship that has been careened. It's been laid on its side so that they can clean the bottom. That'll give you a feeling for how shallow the water is there, and out some distance. This is Richard Kemp remembering his childhood in the rocks. Those who knew Sydney Cove years ago will remember the large mudflat on the west side. At the head of it, from this sandy beach, dry at low water ran along to the rocks at the foot of Phillip Street. Don't know what he means by that. It's a rather odd reference, but he's clearly referencing that. And at high water, there was about 3 inches of water at the bank. So this is a huge obstacle to landing up there. This is a painting by Proud in 1842 on the west side. You can see how far out the mudflats are going. Now, this is later on when clearance in the town has caused sand and muck to be washed down, and the problem has got quite severe. The original circular quay or semicircular quay was built to overcome this problem. You couldn't get ships anywhere near shore anymore. So this is sort of this historic problem that Sydney Cove had. On the east side, in 1803, we're told by the Sydney Gazette, the government wharf on the east side was extended by 30 feet. Why? By means of which boats belonging to His Majesty's vessels may land at low water without the inconveniences to which they were exposed. 30 feet they had to push it out. And here's a painting of that in 1809 of the east side. You can see the wharf being pushed out. This is the east side wharf close to the Loftus Street alignment. And you can see how far the sand comes. What isn't as clear in this, but it is clear in the original, is that there is brown underneath the blue up the top there. It's sandy, it's shallow. And they've had to push this wharf out a long way in order to get boats alongside. So even on the east side, this was a major obstacle and not the sort of thing you'd want to be dragging anvils and bellows across in order to bring them ashore to set up for the camp. Further down, you have rocks and deep water. So this is the Sydney Morning Herald, somebody writing in the Sydney Morning Herald in 1826, reflecting on Sydney and how much it had changed. He said, when we take a retrospect of the last 18 or 20 years, we're scarcely able to credit a census. When we call to mind that Garden Island was a receptacle for the sick, that the North Shore was a nursery for children, that the Sydney Wharf was the natural rocks, and that the streets were called rows and thickly studded with stumps of trees. This is a guy called an emigrant mechanic who wrote in 1842, and he sort of segments his recollections, and he recalls arriving in the 1820s. And he says, one of the excellences of the site of Sydney is that either deep water washes the rock on which it's built, or where it's not, a good depth can be, with very little difficulty, be artificially obtained by a short jetty. No short jetty on the 26th of January, you've basically got to use the rock. Just a series of paintings now that show these rocks, which are all buried, so we don't see them now. They've been buried under circular quay. Forget about the red circle, that's just like the image, the only image I could get online. But the blue circle shows the rocks around the international terminal, is the overseas passenger terminal. Here's Port Jackson Painter, unidentified, 1792-4. Again, you can see the sort of sandy up here, rocky as you go down. This is attributed to King. It's in the King family, was in the King family collection 1800 when he was back as governor. And again, you can see rocks. This outcrop here and this side is Campbell's Cove. And so we're seeing that side. And this house here is Piper's house that Michael referred to, very important site. There were a number of places along the cove where they could have landed. This is Garling in 1839, showing down near Dawes Point. And so you can see flat rock dropping off into deep water, interspersed with big rocks getting in the way, but he conceivably could have landed there. It would have worked, it's just too far away. So there's a number of places where conceivably it might have been possible to do it. The site we're talking about is the Mariners Church site behind the overseas passenger terminal, which you can see there. That's the back of the Mariners Church, and as Michael indicated, that's what we've got on the site where we're saying Phillip landed. We're honouring him. This is a photograph in 1880 when we don't have the overseas passenger terminal there. There's the Mariners Church, which is still there today, so you can locate this. Here's the landing place, and this here is Bethel Street, is the road that was there, that was the access up to George Street level for moving people and materials up and down. So Richard Kemp knew this site well as a boy. He lived just across the road in George Street, and he used to swim there at this site. So he said when Governor Phillip landed, there was, between the Mariners Church and the Sailors' Home where they stand, a very large flat rock set on its edge. Inside this rock was a snug little cove, the mouth being about 16 foot wide, a depth of about 20 feet, a white sandy beach went along the shore side. My bathing place as a youngster. A very large flat rocks, this is another description, set on its edge. And he gives quite specific description of what he could remember of its size. Here's a painting of the Piper's house in 1802. Piper wasn't in it yet, but we'll just stick with that name for now. And you can see in front of it large flat rocks, and there's a boat here which obscures another large rock, and you get the impression of shallowness when you can sort of get a better image of that. Here's John Lewin 7 years later. Again, we're seeing the same image. Here's Piper's house. Here's these big flat rocks. Again, the southern end of this obscured by the ship that's anchored there. This over here is Campbell's Cove, and these are the Campbell properties at that time. This is Richard Reed in 1820, taking it from the North Shore, and this is Campbell's house. It is now Campbell's house, and he shows this rock here, which is probably the southernmost rock. We'll see it in a minute, and in my view, he has exaggerated the size for artistic purposes. It's almost certain this is the same rock painted in 1792-4 by Watling a view out from the Surgeon General's house, and that pretty much is in the alignment of that site. And that's, you can see the same sort of scalloped undercut, Sydney, the sort of way you get the sandstone being weathered out underneath. And you can see the Aborigines are using this site. There's a lot of paintings showing Aborigines around this area. Almost certainly this was a favourite launching off point for their canoes. And here's a plan. There are a group of these starting in 1823 that go through until this site is buried in 1841 by the then Circular Quay work, which shows, again, we've got what is Piper's house, and these two rocks here, rocks along the shore, this large rock here, with this rather interesting platform which occurs in all of this series of drawings. And it is possible that that in fact is a platform that was erected as sort of a wharf in order to be able to bring things ashore. It is clearly of human construction. We have no other image of it. This is Martin's in 1838. You won't see the house there because it's been pulled down, but here again you'll see these rocks. This is the Campbell properties, and you'll see these large flat rocks. So we're getting a very clear impression of what's there. This was the landing place, and we've got a number of references to this landing place that existed before Hospital Wharf. This is the log of the Alexander, one of the first fleet ships, and she says at 4 a.m. on the 27th of January, she walked into the cove, close to the landing place, moored the ship, head and stern, landing, equipage, etc. Here's Bradley's drawing of the ships as they were on the 27th of January 1788. Here is the Alexander, and she is closest to a group of rocks which he has drawn there, which occur repeatedly in these early paintings. This is Dawes, July 1788. Here's a ridge coming down. The only ridge that can be is the ridge that the Mariners Church is on, and he's marked two little rocks there. Here's the Port Jackson painter in October of 1788. He doesn't show the rock, but he identifies something called Reed's Rock. Our best guess on that is that is Robinson Reed, who was the carpenter of the Supply and was probably given the job of building the wharf that was built at that first landing place in March of 1788. Here's Hunter in about 1790, and again you can see those two little rocks. This is a very distinct You don't get this turning up anywhere else along the west side of the Cove. So why did Phillip choose this site? Firstly, because it's a rock shelf. You get this description from Beau Smythe. The ships, some of them, he's writing on the 27th of January, lay so near the stone cliffs that you may with ease jump from ship on shore. The water here, even to the very edge of the shore, is 5 and 6 fathoms. That's fathoms 6 feet. And exactly like a canal in a garden. Canal garden was where you put in dressed stone on either side, and you had in a garden, and you had a canal through it. It's like it's been done by stonemasons. You may with ease fasten the ships to the trees instead of putting down the anchor, and in fact we have drawings of ships that are fastened on shore. They're that close to shore. It would have looked like this. This is the garden one. It would have been a flat stone surface, and then it drops off precipitously into 5 or 6 fathoms. This is the emigrant mechanic. Deep water washes the rock on which the Sydney's built. This is the account of a visiting Russian ship in 1820. At length, he said, we sighted Sydney proper in a narrow inlet, Sydney Cove, and there we let go anchor right by Captain Piper's house. We moored so that gangplanks could be run out. They were so close to the edge they could just stick a gangplank out. We could plainly hear everything that was said in the captain's dwelling. They're that close. We were standing in 6 fathoms of water, mud bottom. So Phillip comes back. He's identified a site where you can park big ships right along the shore. Why would he go ashore across mud flats when he specifically said, this is a great spot, you can actually park your ship up against the shore? Now, they didn't do that once all the merchant ships were in there because there were too many of them. It's just too much moving to be done. So they just used boats between them. So let's come back again. Here we are with, again, the 1880. Here's the Mariners' Church. Here's the landing place. Here's the street. And this is another reason why Phillip chose this site. There was already an access way from the beach up to the George Street level where they were going to be living. And you'll see here behind, this was the dead house, the mortuary, you'll see there's rocks here, and these are important. We'll just come to them in just a second. Here is an 1833 plan that the council has added over in 1880 when they were making changes. And you'll see here's the dead house, here's the mortuary, and they're showing this is the water here, Mariners' Church. Here's a proposed road. Here's rocks beneath the Mariners' Church, and here's rocks on the other side that we just saw. So there's a gap between, a natural gap between the rocks. Here's the Mariners' Church in 1858 when it's not quite finished. They're still building it. And Michael noticed this. Here you can see the rocks are higher. They're still sort of doing work on redeveloping the Bethel Street. Bethel Street's gone now, except for this fragment underneath the Mariners' Church that we can see. And here's this quite high section of rock. So there was a natural pathway. And some of the early paintings, this happens in a number of them. This is one attributed to Hunter, view of Sydney Cove in 1793, probably done about 1795. You can see this is the line of George Street, and here's a gap between the rocks right at the point where that would have been coming off. So what was Phillip seeing as he looked ashore to land on the 26th of January 1788? Wipe out the buildings and populate that with a lot of trees, and that's what you're seeing. You're seeing this rocky, these large rocks, quite a steep climb behind that isn't shown well in that painting, and a beach where he could take the ship ashore. This is the French sketch of the same one. There's sort of these rocks, place where they could moor the ship and then work their way up to the left, up to take goods and provisions ashore. That's our proposition. We're over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name's Margaret Hoggett, and I give a talk every year about the First Fleet. This year on Australia Day, and every year at 6 o'clock we go to the flag at Loftus Street, a few of my friends, and just commemorate because the flag is there. But I'm willing to accept a new proposition. I hadn't seen any of this information, and I mean, we only have a bus stop there. Why not a toilet? There was a sign there attached to the flagpole a few years ago. Special commemorative event happening on 26th of January, don't park here. They put it on the flagpole. They don't do it anymore. Thank you. I'm willing to accept it's all new information. Thank you. I have to go. I'm sorry.
Thanks, Margaret. Any other questions?
Mr. Flynn said that the gentlemen's quarters were on the east side.
Yeah.
So how big a population would it have been on the east side?
Well, it was a very small population because on the east side is where Phillip was, with his own personal staff, and with the Judge Advocate David Collins, the minister, and they had a small party of convicts. A number of the better behaved female convicts were there, and some well-behaved male convicts who had skills and were helping to get the farm and gardens going. But in fact, the vast majority of Colony, at least 1,000 people, I would say, were on the west side, which is nearly all the Marines, nearly all the convicts on the west side. So
it'd be 30 or 40, 50, it's that order of magnitude, are settled there in those early days, and everyone else is west side.
So the Marines were around where the corner of Grosvenor and George Street and Bridge Street, around that side. And a lot of the male convicts were a little bit up the hill, up towards Loftus Street. There was some natural feature which suited them to keep the male convicts there. And the females were a little bit more like around Harrington to George Street. They had a little female convict camp there. So a lot of the women were on the west side as well. Next.
Okay, we've got a question here, and then this one there.
What actually was at Macquarie Place at that time, 1788 and 1789?
Garden.
Were just mud flats or?
No. Well, when they landed?
In the early...
There's the odd rock, but we don't call that area the rocks because there weren't a lot of rocks there. It's essentially a gentle rise, the odd rock, but where Macquarie Place is now was where the garden was put. So you've got soil that's deep enough for them to be able to. They had to get the plants, of course, into the ground as soon as they could. So that's so it's very much sort of garden. You don't get. I mean, the rocks is called the rocks because it was rocky.
And just quickly, if I could just add to that around Tank Stream, in the early pictures, we see really dense bush and big trees, a little bit more rainforesty because of the fresh water. That's another feature of that site.
Well, thank you very much for this illuminating talk. Richard Tanner's my name. I'm chairman of the Sydney Portsmouth Sister City Committee with the Town Hall in Sydney and our counterparts in Portsmouth. We've had quite a battle over the last decade, I guess, to recite the bonds of friendship sculpture, which is those two concentric slugs, as you like to call them. And originally this was in the forecourt of Customs House Square. For political reasons, it disappeared for 7 or 8 years until we started agitating and finally got it out of storage, and it was put in Jessie Street Gardens. One of the disadvantages there is that at the back of the Paragon Hotel, and the patrons urinate on it, and if that doesn't cause enough distress to the two copper slugs, then the lily-pilly berries do. So the whole site is most unsatisfactory. We have been toying with the idea of restoring the statue back in Customs House Square, but I think following this presentation it's obvious that I think a lot more work should be done and a lot more sculpturing of this most important site should take place. So we'd be very glad to work with you to see if something could be developed to commemorate this site with all its history and how you arrived at it.
There's a question here. Nick?
You haven't pointed out that Thomas Campbell was writing about something that he didn't see. And I'm wondering why you haven't made that point. And you've not done that in anything that you've published so far. And what's the significance for your assessment of his letter and the evidence you're relying upon of the fact that he did actually see it?
Okay, I can answer that. John Campbell was on the Lady Penrhyn, so he, as far as we know, wasn't on the Supply, which was there when they first landed and put up the flagpole. But David Collins, who wrote the description that everyone relies on, he wasn't there either, because he wasn't on the Supply. So in fact, but what they did see is they saw the flagpole which was at the site. and they landed at that site. So everyone who came back after the ceremony landed at that point at the landing place where the flagpole was. So there were eyewitnesses to the site, which was marked by the flagpole, and it was the place where they landed, which was, as I say, not on the east side. So John Campbell was an eyewitness to the flagpole being on that site.
His most likely source is a marine. So why do we say that? So look at what's being described. It's taken possession of by a company of grenadiers, marines and some convicts. And he said orders are given for the soldiers. He's basically describing what the soldiers do. To march up to the west side and they have the ceremony. And then he says then they march up the head of the cove where they pitch their tents. That isn't what the convicts did. The convicts and the crew members were taken back on board the supply. And they were kept on the supply at night because there was a concern about their physical security for the Aborigines, possibly. So this is a description of what the Marines did that afternoon that makes it now likely. And it's a very visual description. He's describing, if you look at it, it's describing movement. So it's likely that what we've got here is a Marine having passed that description on to Campbell. Remember, these people had lived with each other, cheek by jowl, for 8 months. They're phenomenally close. So there's some very close relationships that built up between people, the various players.
And if I could just add to that, John Campbell had been on the Lady Penrhyn, and the two officers of the Marines, George Johnston and William Collins, had been gone onto the supply with Phillip to go around to the City Cove. They were there at the ceremony, and then they would be setting up their tents, and they had been on that long voyage with John Campbell. And either he or the Marines, it's even possible that Campbell actually had been taken by Collins or Johnston as a servant or an assistant with them. He may have been there, for all we know. But certainly these two young officers who had been on the Lady Penrhyn went back the next day. They were talking to their shipmates, telling them what had happened. And they told them
that... there's various, Nagel gives us a West Side narrative as well, as does Howe's 1806 Almanac. The thing that's important to remember is there are no journals and no recollections of an East Side landing, none. Now these old men who wrote in the 1880s onwards may well have been mistaken. That's the problem with oral histories, with people remembering. But if there was someone, just someone at all, who remembered an East Side landing and ceremony, that might provide an argument. But there are none. Zero. Zip. The first time anyone mentions this is 1848, and is not somebody who'd been living in the settlement. So, okay, it's not 100%, but, there just sort of isn't a counter case. There isn't a body of evidence that means we've got to sort of weigh this up against that body of evidence. There isn't any. It's just not there.
So the pattern of evidence comes from 1806, the 1820s, 1832, people protesting about tree cutting down. That's when first leaders were alive. First point we have is Fowles in 1848. He's the one, that's just after London is dead. Virtually no one is alive who was there, who can remember it. And that's the first piece of evidence. So there's a pattern of evidence that was in currency from people who were alive on that day who were there and who had talked to people.
Bruce, we've got a question down here.
Thank you for your talk, it was excellent. I just wanted to ask you what sort of evidence that's been around for the East Side landing and why you discounted that. And really what triggered you to take an interest in this issue?
The evidence is the evidence we presented. So it is, Bradley's journal is the great body of evidence that is relied on by Minnie Lee in particular. I think Alfred's dead by that point. And it arrived as just this bolt from the blue. We had suddenly a new piece of evidence. I've tried to work out why it is that they assume that where a flagpole was in August tells us anything about where a flagpole was in January. We do have that, and the 1963 committee relies quite heavily on those coordinates. And the surveyor, the recently retired New South Wales Surveyor General, was on that committee. And I, for a long time, just sort of accepted it. But then I sat down and just put those coordinates into, you've now got these online websites where you can plot latitude and longitude, and it turns up out where that screenshot shows you. It's just, and where something was on the 6th of February still doesn't tell us where anything was on the 26th of January. So that's it, other than this sort of assertion that emerges from 1848 onwards. Minnie Lee developed this theory that Macquarie had put documents inside the obelisk and we should tear it down or open it up and pull these documents out. I mean, there is no basis for this. This is just a passionate belief. So I continue to be baffled as to why this. The problem up until very recently is that there was no clear counter, the evidence the other way. There was nothing to sort of counter it, so everyone just quoted each other. We've now sort of got, I think, an accumulation of evidence that does point to the west side, where comparatively we have virtually nothing on the east. What led me to do it? I came back from the UK. I had 10 years in the UK in 2011, had been working on a history of the early convict ships, and got on to Wayne Johnson, the archaeologist at the Rocks at Shooker, and said, walk me round this settlement as it was in 1788. And as part of that walk around, he showed me the recently discovered Bethel Lane and the plaque, and as I sort of looked at that, it challenged me, and I just went off and began to work through sources. I mean, as Michael said, this is the dream time, the dream era of original researchers. We can now access so much material in its original online or indexes online. So that was what really the great advantage we have, is there's just this massive material. These images that you're seeing, most of which you won't have seen, are just now, I mean, what we've done is blown up segments of bigger paintings. But these are of such a quality now that you can do that. You can sort of zoom in and really look closely at parts of the harbour and of parts of the settlement that historically, because the quality of the images weren't available online or in good quality book form, and we can do that now. We can the quality is so high that we can go in and really scrutinise specifics. That was for me.
Oral history sources there. I've read previously that the Oaksmith convicts, they've got a proud tradition within that family that I think it was Francis Oakes, was the first man to set foot in Australia. He kept piggyback Arthur Phillip onto the shore. Would you have any comment on that? And just another brief one, for such an important roadway, how did Bethel Street get its name? Because often street names are moved to a past.
Yeah. I can answer that one. So, in terms of how Bethel Street got its name, the church that was built was originally known as the Bethel Church. The Bethel Union was a mission to seamen, and it was meant to be oriented towards the seafarers coming to Sydney Cove to minister to them, both social services, church social services, as well as church services. In terms of the, I think you mentioned Francis Oakes. Francis Oakes was actually a missionary who came out of the 1790s. He wasn't on the first fleet, so the oral history in families is the descendants of Owen Kavanagh, who was a sailor on the Surprize. His descendants had I haven't found that prior to 1900, but certainly it appears in that family where I've seen it. And then the other major story, there are two others. There is the Cable family, the descendants of Henry Cable, the first fleet convict. And there is a strong link going back to his daughter. I think it's in his daughter's obituary in the 1850s, where it's said that her father carried Philip, and he was a big, strong man, carried Philip ashore, and was, as a result, the first of the settlers, first European of the first fleet to set foot, which may have been at Botany Bay, may have been at Sydney Cove, but that was the oral history in that family, and whether it's very hard to tell. And the other story is James Roos, the first man to successfully row wheat in Australia, the convict of the first fleet. He appeared in a court case in the early 20s and asked to describe himself. He said, I was the first man to land in Australia, and I carried Captain Johnston on my back, and I was the first one who did. So he claimed it. So who was the first out of those three? It might have been one of them, or it might have been any of them, or it might have been someone else, and they might have been one of the first.
One last question here, I think.
My name is Stephen Noon. I've spoken with you, Gary. I have one comment and two brief questions. The first comment is on the flagstaff. I took it when I saw that flag as being just designating the seat of power, government power. Government House was there, gardens, Governor's Gardens, Government Wharf. I never really thought it was designating a landing spot. It never occurred to me. So it just seemed logical that that would be a flag, being a flag. Yeah. Yeah. First question was that Bradley's map shows a whole lot of soundings in the Cove, which I take to be fathoms, although in some locations it's shown as feet. And Smythe Bows talks about 5.5 to 6 fathoms adjacent to those rocks near those landing spots. They line line up. I haven't been able to look at that map very closely to see exactly what, how the map and the Smythe's comments line up.
One of them is that Dawes or Bradley shows...
The best one is William Dawes's map chart of Sydney Cove in July 1788. And there is, in fact, the one that's commonly published is a copy made in the 1880s, but the original, which is in London in the public record of the National Archives, which is the one we showed, we've got a copy of it, that is the most accurate one, and that concurs, showing the deepest readings in terms of
most of them along the seashore seem to be around about 4 fathoms.
That's right, 3 or 4.
Drops down to 7.
And then it's got 5, I think.
There is a 5 on the original of Dawes, and he was trained surveyor and engineer.
The reason I'm interested is I'm trying to model the Cove, the GS, and I'm getting confused.
Well, you will. Can I say you will get confused?
Yes.
And you've got to, with all of these sources, maps and drawings and written sources, you've just simply got to work with all of them, and you will find inconsistencies between them, and you've just got to professionally try to work out why those inconsistencies exist and how you try to reconcile them. I mean, it's not, you know.
The second question is very brief, but your lecture today is very, very interesting, but it is a fairly, what I say, an esoteric group, very interested in one subject. Have you got a strategy or something to develop this into a proposal to government or media? Gary, you'd be pretty good at developing government strategies, I think. Like a brand plan, like where do we go from here?
Well, I suppose our responsibility is to try to put the thing on the record. We're having discussions about having this material, very detailed, a more detailed version of that published, which we, those discussions are well advanced. Obviously, there's a lot of discussions to be had. The Sydney City Council erected the one in Loftus Street. There's going to have to be some conversations with them to see if they are prepared to revise their position. At the moment, in effect, Sydney Harbour Foreshore Authority is saying, look, probably over here, and Sydney City Council is saying, well, no, we think here. So if you like, we have a debate going on, silently at least at the moment.
Perhaps it could be drawn to the general public's nerves.
Yeah. I wish the general public really cared about our own history that much.
Please join me in thanking our speakers.